They thought Elijah Cross was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. A roadside pull-off near the Grand Canyon, a trunk open, a camera bag, a mother stretching her legs. They saw suspicion. They saw threat. They didn't see the decorated Delta Force commander, or the man who'd buried more brothers in arms than they could count. When they shouted, he stayed calm. When they aimed, his mother raised her camera. When they fired, she fell. They thought the story ended there, but they didn't realize who they left standing and what he was willing to do for justice. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The sun poured over the horizon in long golden sheets as the black SUV cruised down Highway 89. A steady hum beneath the tires, echoing the calm inside. The world stretched wide here. Nothing but desert plains, rust-colored rock formations, and endless sky. The kind of space where time felt slower, more generous, like it knew you'd come to breathe. Inside the vehicle, Elijah Cross sat behind the wheel, one hand resting casually at 12 o'clock, the other occasionally tapping against the steering wheel, in rhythm with a soft jazz tune drifting from the speakers. Beside him, in the passenger seat, his mother, Miriam Cross, tilted her head to the side, letting the breeze from the half-open window kiss her face. Her silver curls fluttered in the wind, her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses. A camera rested on her lap. The old kind, the one with weight and soul, not like the flat devices most people carried now. She had used it for decades. Weddings, graduations, Sunday picnics. Today, she was saving it for something else entirely. 70 deserved more than cake. "You sure you don't want to stop for pie and Flagstaff?" she asked, half teasing, half serious, her hand resting lightly over his forearm. Elijah smirked. "We've had pie and Flagstaff, remember? That place with the waitress who couldn't believe I was your son. She thought you were my bodyguard." Miriam chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Said you looked too serious to be related." "I was serious." "She was about to forget your change." She laughed again, warm and full. Elijah glanced at her. Really looked. She was aging, but gracefully, like the long-limbed trees they'd passed back in Sedona, dignified in her presence and light in her spirit. This trip had been her idea, of course. A birthday wish whispered over breakfast months ago. "I want to see the earth open up at the edge. I want to stand somewhere that makes me feel small in a good way." Now, just a few miles from the Grand Canyon's quieter east rim, they were almost there. The road narrowed slightly as they turned onto a pull-off near Desert View Point, one of the lesser-known spots. Elijah preferred it that way. Less noise, more sky. The SUV rolled into a gravel patch, and he shifted into park. He stepped out and stretched, his lean frame unfolding in the sunlight. Fitted gray t-shirt, cargo pants, clean cut, every movement precise, controlled. Years of muscle memory that never left him, no matter how far from command he tried to live. Miriam stepped out more slowly, groaning a little as her joints adjusted. Elijah immediately came around to offer his arm, but she waved him off with a grin. "I've got it, soldier." Let an old woman feel the ground under her feet. He nodded, watching her with quiet care as she raised the camera and began snapping shots. The horizon, the vast canyon lip in the distance, even the small scrub brush at her feet. She had a way of seeing things others didn't. Elijah walked to the rear of the SUV and opened the trunk. Reaching for her backpack, he noticed a shadow move along the edge of the ridge. His eyes shifted subtly. There, up by the main trail, a white park ranger stood beside his patrol truck, one hand on his belt, the other loosely holding a radio mic. He wasn't looking at the view. He was looking at them. Not glaring, not smiling either. Just watching. Elijah kept his posture casual. He grabbed the bag, closed the trunk gently, and walked back toward his mother. "Everything okay?" Miriam asked, lowering the camera. He gave a small nod. "Just a ranger up on the trail." She followed his gaze. "Maybe he's enjoying the view." Maybe. There was a shift in the air then, small but distinct. A low rumble in the distance signaled another vehicle approaching, tires crunching on gravel. Elijah turned his head just enough to glimpse a tan state trooper cruiser slowing near the entrance. It didn't pull in. It waited. Engine running. Miriam noticed it too. Her voice dropped just a hair. "You feel that?" He nodded once. "Yeah." A pause. The breeze rustled the nearby sagebrush. "Let's not stay too long," she said gently. "Got more miles to go." Elijah offered a faint smile and looked up at the sky. The sun was still generous, but the day had taken a breath and held it just for a moment. Elijah Cross stood by the open trunk, carefully adjusting the camera bag's strap, when the distant snap of radio static broke the quiet rhythm of the canyon wind. The sound was faint and easily dismissed by most, just another background hum beneath the sky. But to Elijah, it struck like a flicker in a room full of calm. His instincts, sharpened by years of disciplined service, didn't just hear the tone. They registered the clipped urgency buried inside it. He didn't need to turn around. He already knew. The ranger was reporting him, up on the ridge, still leaning beside his patrol truck with one hand resting over his belt. Ranger Todd Ellison kept his eyes trained on the pair below. He said nothing to them, made no move to engage, and gave no gesture of reassurance. He simply observed with a narrowed gaze, posture rigid, in a way that didn't belong in a peaceful overlook where an older woman and her son had merely pulled over to stretch their legs. But Ellison's mind had already decided what it was seeing. A black man rummaging through the back of a vehicle that, in his eyes, looked too new, too spotless, and too expensive to belong to him. To Ellison, the presence of a black man in this setting required suspicion, not understanding. "Dispatch," Ellison muttered quietly into his radio, the words slipping out with restrained certainty. "I've got a suspicious subject at Desert View Pull-Off, possible 1062, looks like he's trying to break into a vehicle. Male, black, mid-40s, military cut, dark shirt and cargo pants. Standing at the rear of a black SUV, requesting local unit support, just in case." The reply crackled back in acknowledgement, and that was all he needed. He stayed where he was, still and silent, watching from above. Down below, Elijah lifted his head as the last word hit the air, catching his mother's glance as she turned away from the canyon's edge. Her expression had softened from the joy of the view, but now carried something else, something quiet, alert, and all too familiar. It wasn't panic, it was recognition, the kind that came from a life of learning to sense trouble before it introduced itself. "Elijah," Miriam called gently, her voice measured and unshaken. "Did you get the extra lens?" He held up the bag, giving her a nod. "Got it." She began walking back toward him across the gravel lot, her smile still present but fading slightly, her posture more purposeful than it had been moments ago. A low mechanical growl rode the breeze, the sound of tires chewing into gravel with controlled slowness. Elijah turned his head in time to see the white state trooper cruiser rolling in just beyond the entrance to the overlook. Behind it, a sheriff's SUV followed closely. The doors didn't open right away. Instead, the three men inside waited, surveying, assembling whatever scenario had been described over the radio. Then, almost in perfect rhythm, all three stepped out and moved with synchronized purpose. No words, no introductions, no hesitation. It wasn't the behavior of peacekeepers responding to a misunderstanding. It was the choreography of men preparing for confrontation. The state trooper in front walked with squared shoulders and heavy steps, mirrored sunglasses concealing his gaze, while his mouth remained tight and unsmiling. His name tag read Latimer. Behind him, a thinner, younger man with uncertain eyes and a tense jaw lingered near the SUV's edge. He was clearly less confident, his glance flickering between Elijah and the horizon, as if waiting for someone to tell him what to believe. His name was Cody Moss. Bringing up the rear was a larger man, stockier and older, with a face already hardened by conclusions. His arms hung stiffly at his sides, and his boots bit into the gravel with every step. His badge read Ray Klein. Elijah remained where he was, his hands visible, his posture still. He didn't need to move. He had already understood what was coming. And yet, as always, he was prepared to offer the benefit of the doubt. "Afternoon," Latimer said, not as greeting, but announcement. "We received a report about a suspicious subject near a vehicle. Said someone was possibly attempting to break in." Elijah offered no defensiveness, no raised tone. "This is my vehicle," he said clearly, calmly. "We're just traveling through." The officers didn't acknowledge his statement. Instead, Latimer added, "I need you to present identification." Elijah didn't flinch. He raised his hands slightly, palms out, fingers open. "Of course, sir. My wallet is in my front pocket. I'm going to reach for it slowly." Before he could finish, Klein took a hard step forward, his voice already aggressive. "Not yet. Keep your hands right there." Miriam arrived at Elijah's side and instinctively positioned herself beside him, her hand brushing lightly against his elbow. Not out of fear, but out of reassurance. Her expression was still composed, but the calm was wearing thin. "Officers," she said with warmth wrapped in steel, "this is my son, Elijah Cross. We're on a birthday trip. That's our vehicle. You can verify the plate, the registration, and everything else. He's done nothing wrong." Latimer didn't turn to her. His gaze stayed on Elijah. "You have a problem with us doing our job, ma'am?" "I have a problem with assumptions," she replied. "You arrived with 3 units for a man taking something out of his own trunk. Doesn't feel like protocol. Feels like profiling." Moss shifted uneasily, glancing into the passenger side window. "Can we get registration and insurance, please?" "It's in the glove box," Elijah answered. "I'd prefer my mother get it." "No sudden moves," Klein said, his voice low but sharp. "We'll treat this like a felony stop if we have to." "You don't have to," Miriam said, walking to the passenger door with slow and visible steps. "You just don't want to admit that you overreacted." She retrieved the documents, turned, and handed them over. Moss took them, quickly skimming the information, while Latimer and Klein remained motionless. "They check out," Moss muttered under his breath. Klein's response was a grunt. "Paperwork don't mean the car ain't stolen. He could have found it. You'd be amazed what these guys pull off." "These guys?" Elijah asked, eyes locked on him now. Klein chewed slowly. "You heard me." Miriam stepped in again, her voice now colder. "No, I don't think you understand who you're talking to." "I understand exactly what I'm seeing," Klein snapped. Latimer, still silent, finally said, "Sir, for our safety, we're going to ask you to kneel." "I won't do that," Elijah said, voice like a wire stretched tight. "I haven't committed a crime, and I won't be humiliated for your comfort." "You refuse a lawful order," Latimer said. "That makes this a use of force situation." "No," Miriam interjected, her voice ringing clear against the heavy stillness. "That makes it a power play." The canyon wind pressed around them, brushing past rocks and sage like a whispered warning, the kind that never came loud, but still managed to rattle something beneath the skin. The silence that followed her words held longer than any of them expected, stretching over the gravel lot like a veil. Nothing moved, not the breeze, not the men, not even the sun, which seemed suspended in its slow descent. It was the kind of stillness that always came just before something broke. Elijah stood tall, unflinching, his expression unreadable. There was no threat in his body, no tension in his hands, but his refusal had struck something deeper than protocol. It had pierced something they didn't know how to name. A refusal not of command, but of submission. Klein's eyes twitched. Latimer's hand hovered lower on his holster. And then Miriam stepped forward, slowly but without hesitation, her camera hanging from one hand, the strap tangled around her fingers from where she'd looped it earlier in distraction. Her voice remained calm, almost maternal, as she raised her free hand and placed herself directly between her son and the officers. "Listen to me," she said. "This doesn't need to go any further. You have the paperwork. You have the names. You have nothing left to fear except being wrong, and that's not something you shoot over. Klein's mouth curled. Ma'am, step back. Now. I'm not going to let you treat him like an animal because you feel threatened by the fact that he's standing, she said. You don't get to make fear a weapon. As she stepped again toward Elijah, the camera, still swinging from her hand, caught the light, its metallic body glinting just briefly in the sun. The shape of it, the angle, the motion, it was enough. He's got a weapon, shouted, his voice breaking on the last word. No! Elijah's voice cracked like thunder, arms spreading in a protective arc. But it was too late. The gunshots came like hammer strikes, two sharp, concussive bursts that echoed through the canyon and scattered the birds from the cliffs above. The silence that followed was heavier than the shots themselves, unbearable in its finality. Miriam's body jolted back as the impact twisted her sideways, her knees buckling before she ever hit the ground. Her camera spun from her grasp and crashed against the rocks beside her. Elijah lunged forward, catching her just as she fell, her weight crumpling into his arms, her blood soaking through the fabric of his shirt like ink spilling through paper. He held her close, his knees hitting the ground with a dull thud, and for a moment there was nothing but the rasp of his breath and the stunned disbelief in his eyes. Her chest no longer rose, her lips no longer formed words. Her warmth, so constant, so grounding, was already fading into the dust. Then came the barking. Get on the ground! Hands behind your head! Now! Elijah didn't move, still clutching her, his body hunched around hers like a human shield long after the threat had passed. I said now! Klein screamed, his weapon still raised, his face blotched with fear and fury. It wasn't until a boot crashed into Elijah's ribs that his grip loosened. They dragged him away from her, forcing his arms behind his back with so much pressure that his shoulders popped as he was pinned to the gravel, his face scraping against the rocks, the blood on his cheek not his own. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He didn't fight. But his eyes, locked on her still body just feet away, didn't blink. They zip-tied his wrists. They shackled his ankles. They called for an ambulance that was 20 minutes too late. And when the trooper knelt beside Miriam and finally realized what had happened, when the weight of it showed in the way Moss turned his back and doubled over behind the SUV, it didn't change the outcome. Not a single man apologized. Not a single voice said her name. Latimer muttered into his radio, his voice suddenly colder, more mechanical. Suspect is secure. One civilian down. Non-compliant during lawful stop. Officers discharged weapons fearing threat. No acknowledgement of the mistake. No retraction of the lie. The gravel burned into Elijah's skin as they lifted him off the ground, shoving him into the back of the cruiser. His clothes were stained, his lips bloodied, and his wrists already raw from the restraint. Still, his eyes didn't leave the overlook, not even as the doors slammed shut and the engine roared back to life. From the ridge above, Ranger Ellison hadn't moved. He still stood by his truck, arms crossed, face unreadable, as the scene below played out just as he had expected it might. The canyon wind returned at last, sweeping through the lot, kicking dust across the bloodied camera lying shattered beside the woman who once held it with joy. The red soaked into the gravel. The registration papers fluttered against a tire before being pinned by a heel and forgotten. And when the last echo of gunfire faded, it was replaced only by silence. The kind of silence that left no room for doubt, no space for justice, just the ache of what had been taken, and the certainty that something inside Elijah Cross had broken beyond repair. The room they placed Elijah Cross into was sterile and bare, illuminated harshly by fluorescent lighting that washed the color from the walls and made shadows impossible. He sat alone at a metal table bolted to the floor, his wrists raw from the zip ties they'd eventually replaced with handcuffs, his posture still and his gaze fixed forward without blinking. It had been hours. Exactly how many he couldn't say. Time had lost its shape and meaning somewhere between the gravel-strewn overlook and the unmarked police station off Highway 89. Officers had shuffled him in silence, exchanging glances that told him more clearly than any words could that no truth would be found here, only a story already written to absolve them. When the door opened for the first time, it revealed not an investigator, but a quiet man in a rumpled gray suit, carrying a folder under one arm and fatigue in his expression. He didn't introduce himself. He simply sat across from Elijah, dropped the folder on the table, and studied him with a gaze that wasn't curious, just practiced. "You can start by explaining what happened," he said, without lifting his eyes from the papers inside. Elijah's voice was quiet, steady. "You already know what happened. I need it from you." He took a breath. Not deep, not dramatic, just measured. "My mother and I were on a road trip for her birthday. We stopped at Desert View Point to stretch our legs and take pictures. I was getting the camera bag out of the trunk when a park ranger radioed in a false report. Your officers arrived. They escalated without cause. My mother tried to de-escalate. She was unarmed. They shot her." The man flipped through the file as if Elijah hadn't spoken, making small notations in the margins before closing it again and standing. "We'll be back." He wasn't. Not that day. Elijah remained in that room as the hours folded into each other. They brought him water without a word. A sandwich wrapped in plastic he didn't touch. No one asked questions. No one gave updates. Time crawled like a wounded thing. Occasionally, he could hear movement behind the walls, doors opening, boots on tile, muffled voices behind glass, but nothing was ever meant for him. By the time the first day passed, they moved him to a holding cell. No charges filed, no formal arrest record logged. Just a digital trace of his name in a file marked "Pending Review." The cot was thin and uneven. The air smelled like bleach and old metal. He slept in short bursts, more from instinct than exhaustion, eyes opening with every echoing clang beyond the bars. On the second day, someone came to take his fingerprints again, even though they already had them. Another officer photographed him without explanation. They asked him no new questions, offered no answers. There was no indication that any action was being taken, no mention of his mother's name, no reference to the incident. The silence wasn't negligence, it was deliberate. They weren't investigating a crime, they were waiting for it to be forgotten. When the 48th hour arrived, it did so without ceremony. A uniformed officer came to his cell just after dawn, handed him a manila envelope with his wallet and keys inside, and told him he was free to go. He asked if his vehicle was intact. The officer said it was an impound and could be retrieved later that day. He asked where his mother was. "Coroner has her," the man said flatly, eyes never lifting. Elijah didn't speak as they walked him out through a back corridor and onto a cracked sidewalk behind the station, the morning wind tugging at the hem of his shirt like a reminder that the world had gone on living without him. No one met him. No one offered a ride. No one explained why no one would be held accountable. His SUV had been cleaned. The blood was gone. The seat scrubbed. The scent replaced by something chemical and wrong. The paperwork confirming its release was signed by a deputy whose name he didn't recognize. He didn't bother asking questions. He got in, adjusted the seat, and drove. The return home was hollow. Miriam's absence filled every space they'd once shared. Her scent still lingered faintly in the guest bedroom, where her suitcase sat open, half unpacked. Her handwriting, elegant, patient, rested on a grocery list she'd left near the fridge, a reminder of the mundane, beautiful life that had been taken without cause, apology, or consequence. He buried her 2 days later beneath the shade of a wide, whispering oak at St. Luke's Memorial Cemetery, a place she had chosen years ago, not out of fear of death, but out of belief in preparation. The funeral was small. No cameras, no media, no spectacle. Just a few friends from the church, 2 former colleagues from the school where she'd taught for decades, and Elijah, standing alone as the earth covered what was left of her. The pastor offered kind words, spoken gently. The others tried to meet his eyes, to say something that might soothe or justify or share in the weight, but Elijah gave them nothing, no anger, no grief they could touch. He was there to see it through, not to be consoled. He didn't cry. Not then, not there. He saved his tears for when the last shovel of dirt was packed tight and the sun dipped lower in the sky without any regard for the dead. 3 days later, he found the envelope beneath his front door. It had no return address, no markings, just a smooth white surface with his name written in block print across the center. Inside was a single USB flash drive and a typed note that said only, "They won't give you justice. This might." He hesitated for only a moment before crossing to his laptop, heart steady but heavy, pulse strangely calm as he inserted the drive and clicked play on the single video file inside. Bodycam footage flooded the screen immediately, raw and unedited, the audio sharp and unforgiving. Elijah's breathing stilled as he watched the truth replayed with perfect clarity. The officers' panicked voices rang clear as they shouted conflicting orders. Miriam stepping forward slowly, calmly, pleading for reason, her camera shining briefly in the sunlight, mistaken in a single catastrophic instant for something deadly, the gunshots exploding suddenly, brutally loud, her body collapsing into Elijah's desperate embrace. The video continued, capturing their horrified realization, whispered profanities, frantic rationalizations, their immediate shift to cover the mistake that had cost his mother her life. He watched until the screen went black, his fingers trembling now, not from grief, not from rage, but from an aching clarity settling deep inside his bones. He rewound and played the video once more, forcing himself to absorb every painful detail, every panicked word uttered in the aftermath of the violence they had brought so carelessly into his life. Finally, Elijah closed the laptop and sat back, his mind already shifting, trained, disciplined, methodical. A quiet resolve filled the silence around him, and in the solitude of his home, beneath the shadows of what had been taken, he understood clearly what needed to be done. Justice would not come from courts or investigations, not from apologies or promises of reform. Justice, in this case, would only come from him, and he would deliver it swiftly, silently, and with the precision that had defined his entire life. And then Elijah Cross vanished into the night, knowing exactly how this would end, and who would pay the price for Miriam's life. The desert sky hung low and heavy, brushed with muted shades of twilight, as Elijah Cross stood silently at the edge of the overlook, where Miriam had drawn her last breath. The canyon stretched endlessly beneath him, vast and indifferent, painted in shades of purple and rust by the fading light. The quiet wind whispering gently through sagebrush and dry grass, as though the world itself wished to apologize for what had happened here. But Elijah felt no comfort from the beauty of the place, only a deep, aching emptiness that settled in his chest, sharpening the edges of a grief too raw to express, yet too deep to escape. He'd returned to the canyon only once, to ensure nothing had been left behind. No piece of Miriam's memory still lost in the gravel. His eyes moved slowly across the ground, across stones that had been carefully rearranged, covering any sign of tragedy, of injustice. Now it appeared no different than before, pristine, untouched, as though Miriam Cross had never been here at all. But she had been here, and Elijah remembered every detail. The warmth of her laughter just moments before the violence, the grace in her voice as she'd tried to diffuse the officer's misplaced fear, and finally, the way her camera had twisted in her hand as bullets pierced through silence and flesh alike. He closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself one last moment of mourning before sealing that pain into a place within himself that would fuel what came next. When he opened them again, Elijah turned sharply away from the overlook, climbing into the waiting SUV. He drove back toward his home one final time, knowing he would never return again. Not as himself, not openly, not until justice had been delivered. At his house, Elijah moved through the rooms deliberately, carefully removing any personal trace of his presence. Photographs, letters, medals earned quietly through years of service, all placed methodically into a metal footlocker, the only evidence he intended to leave behind of a life that was no longer possible. His digital trail was next. With practiced precision, Elijah erased every footprint online. Banking records, email accounts, social media, even his veterans' benefits, leaving only empty accounts and vanished records. By morning, Elijah Cross had ceased to exist, his identity reduced to nothing more than ghostly echoes buried deep within databases soon to be forgotten. 2 days after disappearing, Elijah rented a small remote cabin deep in the hills near Flagstaff. Far removed from prying eyes and questions he was no longer willing to answer. The cabin was sparse, barely furnished, chosen precisely because it offered no comfort or distraction. It became a new kind of command center, a base of operations designed solely for the preparation of a mission that demanded his entire being, every fiber of skill and patience he possessed. Here, Elijah resumed the relentless training that had defined his military service, intense physical regimens that hardened muscle and sharpened reflexes, meticulous exercises to perfect coordination and stealth. Early each morning, he rose with the dawn, running through rugged terrain, climbing rocky ledges until his fingertips cracked and bled, pushing his body to exhaustion before methodically repeating it again the next day. His evenings were spent carefully cleaning and inspecting weapons he never intended to fire, because he knew his mission required precision far more intimate and personal than bullets allowed. Yet, even as he prepared himself physically, Elijah knew the true battle lay within his mind and the meticulous information he needed to gather. Each night, beneath the stark glow of a single hanging bulb, Elijah reviewed again the video that had anonymously appeared at his doorstep, the raw, unedited body cam footage that laid bare every panicked word, every desperate attempt by the officers to mask their mistake. This video had not come from a concerned civilian, nor from a sympathetic lawyer. It bore the marks of an insider, someone deep within law enforcement who had access and who wanted him to see the unfiltered truth. Someone inside the machine still believed justice mattered. Elijah had played the footage hundreds of times, absorbing every detail, every gesture, every expression of panic and guilt etched clearly across the faces of the officers responsible. He memorized their names, Latimer, Klein, Moss, and he learned their habits, their schedules, the rhythm of their daily lives. His mission was no impulsive reaction. It was careful, calculated, coldly precise. It was justice distilled to its most essential form. Late one evening, as he meticulously planned, Elijah's attention caught on something small but distinct within the video footage. A brief moment near the end where another officer, clearly uncomfortable, stepped forward and quickly muted his body cam. Elijah watched closely, noting the hesitation in this man's movement, the brief flash of regret in his eyes, and understood instantly why this footage had found its way to him. Someone within their ranks, someone who witnessed firsthand the horror, who could no longer remain silent in the face of such injustice, had chosen him to see this, had trusted him with a responsibility that the official system would never uphold. Elijah carefully isolated the man's face from the video, storing the image securely, knowing this unknown officer could prove useful later, not as an ally exactly, but as proof that even within a corrupt system, integrity could still quietly survive. His training intensified with this new clarity, each exercise becoming more focused, every movement deliberate. He sharpened his reflexes again and again, rehearsed scenarios with brutal accuracy, and prepared himself mentally for the confrontations he knew must inevitably come. Weeks passed unnoticed in the quiet solitude of preparation, the cabin hidden away from eyes that had stopped searching. Authorities had long since moved on, their statements concluded, their explanations carefully constructed and delivered to an indifferent public. They felt safe, secure in the silence they'd purchased with lies. But Elijah had no intention of allowing that silence to stand. Finally, one cold morning just before dawn, Elijah packed lightly and departed the cabin, his body leaner, harder, every sense honed razor-sharp. He left behind no evidence of his stay, no fingerprints, no lingering trace. He moved carefully into the woods, vanishing effortlessly into the shadows. Elijah Cross was no longer a retired soldier, a grieving son, or even a man at all. Not in the eyes of the world. He had become something else entirely. A ghost made flesh, a whisper of justice about to be delivered, silent, cold, and relentless. The pale moonlight glided silently across the cracked pavement and empty parking spaces surrounding the small ranger station just outside Grand Canyon National Park. Shadows stretched quietly in the cool darkness, broken only by a single flickering security light that struggled to illuminate the empty lot. Elijah Cross waited in those shadows, still as stone, his breathing calm and rhythmic as his eyes methodically studied every angle, every entry point, every vulnerability in the quiet building before him. His mind was clear, focused solely on the precise movements he had rehearsed for weeks. Every detail had been calculated, every risk assessed and neutralized. This was no place for error, and Elijah intended none. When the security camera rotated lazily away from the side entrance, Elijah moved swiftly and soundlessly, crossing the empty space in mere seconds. With practiced ease, he disabled the simple electronic lock on the door, the device no match for his training or determination. Once inside, he paused briefly in the dim hallway, listening intently for signs of life, but found only silence. The station, as expected, was unmanned at this hour, its small staff long since home and asleep. Moving forward in silence, Elijah carefully entered the records room at the rear of the station, quickly locating the files he needed. His gloved hands sifted smoothly through drawers, folders, and cabinets, extracting the personnel files, shift rotations, and daily reports that would reveal Ranger Todd Ellison's exact patrol routes and habits. He moved with quiet efficiency, taking pictures of key documents, ensuring nothing appeared disturbed. Within minutes, Elijah had precisely what he needed: a clear map of the Ranger's movements, times, and locations. As swiftly as he'd entered, he exited, leaving behind no evidence, no trace, only empty silence. Back at his cabin, Elijah spread the documents across the rough wooden table beneath the dim, solitary lamp. He studied each page, mapping Ellison's movements meticulously, committing each detail to memory. Ellison was predictable, routine-driven, complacent. A perfect combination for Elijah's needs. He marked the best location for the encounter. A secluded trail Ellison patrolled weekly, early in the morning, always alone. Elijah planned carefully, every possibility considered, every movement choreographed. Nothing would be left to chance. 2 days later, beneath a quiet dawn, Ranger Todd Ellison hiked casually along his usual patrol route, boots crunching softly against dry earth and loose rock. Ellison, comfortable and unaware, paused occasionally to admire the sweeping views, completely oblivious to the careful eyes observing him patiently from within the dense brush ahead. Elijah watched quietly, motionless, his breathing steady, calm, his body poised like a tightly coiled spring. When Ellison approached the narrowest point of the trail, flanked by a steep, rocky drop-off, Elijah moved silently from cover, closing the distance in seconds. Ellison had barely registered movement before Elijah was upon him, swift, silent, surgical. There was no time for Ellison to shout, no space for resistance. Elijah moved with practiced precision, his motions controlled, purposeful, perfectly executed. He delivered precise strikes, pressure points, nerve clusters, instantly disabling any attempt at struggle. His hands moved fluidly, controlled yet powerful, leaving no visible wounds, no evidence of an attack. Ellison staggered briefly, eyes wide with shock, comprehension dawning too late, his balance irretrievably lost. Elijah held him steady for one final moment, just long enough for Ellison to meet his gaze, understanding finally what had happened and why. Elijah's eyes offered no satisfaction, no anger, only an unspoken truth, cold and absolute. And then Elijah released him gently, stepping back silently as Ellison slipped quietly over the edge, his descent swift and inevitable, disappearing soundlessly below the rocky ledge. The echo of Ellison's body striking rocks below was muffled and distant, blending seamlessly with the quiet whispers of the canyon winds. Elijah stood at the edge for a moment, listening carefully to the quiet returned, the canyon unchanged, indifferent to justice or tragedy alike. Then, without haste or urgency, he erased the subtle signs of struggle. Dust shifted, footprints carefully brushed away. When he stepped back into the shadows, it was as if nothing had ever occurred. The trail returned to its pristine emptiness, untouched, silent again beneath the warming sun. The news report appeared quietly 2 days later. A small story buried in local coverage, easily overlooked by most. The headline read simply, "Local Ranger Dies in Freak Accident," followed by a brief account of Ellison's tragic fall during a routine morning patrol. Authorities noted no suspicious circumstances, offered no further investigation, quickly closing the case with quiet resignation. Elijah studied the article silently, felt nothing, not regret, not triumph, only the clear certainty of a step completed, justice begun. He methodically packed away the stolen records, carefully removing all traces of Ellison from his temporary headquarters. Every piece of evidence was destroyed, every memory meticulously erased, the mission complete and perfect in its execution. Elijah knew this was only the first act of his campaign. Carefully planned, patiently executed justice that the law would never deliver. There were still others whose actions had cost Miriam her life, and Elijah would find each one in turn, silent and precise, until the truth and consequences could no longer be ignored. He pulled out the body cam footage again, studying the officers' faces carefully, noting each name, memorizing schedules, habits, routines. Deputy Ray Klein, Deputy Cody Moss, and Trooper Brent Latimer. They were next. Elijah's mission had just begun, and he would remain invisible, relentless, unstoppable. That evening, Elijah burned the last remaining scraps of evidence in the cabin's small wood stove, watching flames consume paper until only fine ashes remained. He stood quietly at the window afterward, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the trees, understanding clearly that what he had started would change him forever. He was no longer merely Elijah Cross, the grieving son, the retired soldier. He had become justice personified, a shadow in the wilderness, silent, implacable. And as darkness wrapped itself around the isolated cabin, Elijah prepared for the next step of his careful, methodical hunt, knowing there could be no turning back, no mercy, no hesitation. Justice was patient, precise, and Elijah had all the time in the world. Trooper Brent Latimer was becoming a haunted man. Sleep no longer brought rest, but instead replayed endlessly the scene at Desert View Point. The panicked shouting, Miriam Cross stepping forward calmly, her camera glinting in the sunlight, and the deafening echo of gunshots that still reverberated in his mind. In those sleepless nights, the shadows that crept along his bedroom walls seemed to whisper accusations, and every small noise outside his window set his heart racing with fear. The official reports had absolved him and his fellow officers of wrongdoing, neatly labeling the shooting as an unfortunate misunderstanding. But Brent knew better. He carried that knowledge silently, the weight growing heavier with each passing day. Each morning, he found himself glancing nervously around, certain he was being watched, hunted by a ghost whose quiet rage had surely survived beyond that terrible day. On a gray Wednesday morning, as Brent moved sluggishly toward his kitchen, he noticed a package sitting ominously on his doorstep. No return address, no labels, just plain brown wrapping that felt oddly sinister in its simplicity. He stood frozen for several moments, his instincts screaming that something dangerous lay waiting inside. But he couldn't leave it unopened, couldn't endure another minute of uncertainty. With trembling fingers, he tore away the wrapping, his heart nearly stopping as he saw what lay beneath. Miriam Cross's camera rested silently on a bed of tissue paper, its lens cracked from impact, the strap still twisted in the familiar shape that haunted his memories. Brent recoiled, as if it had burned him, stumbling backward until he crashed into the table behind him, knocking over a coffee mug that shattered across the floor. This was no random threat. It was a message, a promise. Elijah Cross had not disappeared into oblivion. He was alive, aware, and coming for him. The paranoia that had previously crept around the edges of Brent's life now consumed it completely. He became withdrawn, obsessive, unable to trust even his closest colleagues, afraid to sleep or step outside unarmed. Every shadow became a hiding place, every quiet sound evidence of an intruder. Eventually, desperation drove him to make a foolish, final mistake. He fled, taking refuge in a remote rest stop along a forgotten highway, believing isolation would provide safety. Instead, it provided the perfect opportunity Elijah had patiently anticipated. Brent sat alone in his patrol vehicle in the empty parking lot beneath a flickering street lamp, gripping the steering wheel tightly, breathing heavily with a panic he couldn't control. The lot was silent, bathed in the cold glow of a distant neon sign, when suddenly a quiet shadow appeared at the edge of his peripheral vision. Before Brent could react, the vehicle's door was yanked open violently, and a powerful hand seized him, dragging him from the seat in one fluid, unstoppable movement. Elijah Cross loomed over him, calm, precise, and utterly controlled, his expression devoid of anger or hatred, just cold determination. He wore tactical gear, face partially obscured beneath the shadow of a hood, eyes shining clearly with a restrained intensity. Brent gasped for breath, struggling uselessly against Elijah's iron grip, his voice trembling as he stammered out desperate pleas. "Elijah, please, wait, listen," Brent rasped, struggling against the powerful hold pinning him to the asphalt. "I didn't mean for any of it to happen. I swear, I tried." "You did nothing," Elijah cut in, voice calm yet edged with ice. "And you let it happen." Brent's eyes widened in sheer panic. "No, it wasn't like that. I was ordered not to intervene. I was told to stand down." Elijah's grip tightened, a new stillness taking hold. "Who?" Brent choked back a sob of fear. "It came down from above. The captain himself gave the order. He told us not to escalate any further after it happened, told us how to write the reports, told us not to talk. It wasn't my decision, Elijah. It was out of my control." Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly, but he made no other movement. "You were there. You saw it all. You knew it was wrong. You chose silence." "They would have destroyed me, Elijah," Brent pleaded desperately, his voice cracking with raw fear. "They'd bury me too if I spoke out. You know how it is. The chain of command, the way things work. It wasn't personal. It was personal to me," Elijah said softly, voice almost a whisper, yet carrying the weight of judgment. "And to my mother." Brent's shoulders slumped, defeated, his breath ragged as his eyes filled with helpless regret. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Your apologies change nothing," Elijah replied quietly. He reached into his vest pocket, calmly pulling out a small recording device. He clicked it on, holding it close to Brent's trembling face. "Tell the truth. All of it. Tell me about the order." Brent's voice trembled, but he complied, spilling every detail into the recorder. The exact instructions, the captain's careful manipulation, the explicit threats of consequences if anyone spoke openly about what had truly happened. Every word spilled out rapidly, a flood of long-held guilt finally released under pressure. When Brent had finished, Elijah switched off the device and slipped it back into his pocket. Without another word, he swiftly bound Brent's wrists and ankles with thick zip ties, leaving him lying on the cold pavement, breathing heavily, his face pressed against asphalt. "Please," Brent whispered desperately. "Don't leave me like this." Elijah paused, eyes steady on Brent's frightened face. "My mother deserved more mercy than she got. You will live with the knowledge that someone else paid for your silence. That's more mercy than you gave her." Then Elijah moved quickly, delivering a precise, clinical strike that rendered Brent unconscious instantly, his body falling limp against the pavement. Elijah stood slowly, casting one final glance down at the unconscious trooper before turning and vanishing again into the darkness as seamlessly as he'd appeared. Hours later, authorities found Brent bound, injured, and unconscious, offering no explanation, no evidence, no suspect. All Brent had were whispers of a shadow, one he now knew would never leave him in peace. Elijah Cross was out there still, precise and patient, and he was far from finished. In silence and darkness, Elijah moved on, his mission undeterred, knowing exactly who would be next. Deputy Ray Klein. Deputy Ray Klein had chosen isolation, not as a retreat, but as a fortress, hidden deep in the mountains, surrounded by dense pine forests and reachable only by a narrow dirt road. Klein's cabin stood alone, armed and defiant. Signs declaring private property and threats against trespassers were posted prominently at the property's perimeter. Floodlights, motion sensors, and security cameras covered every possible approach. And Klein himself kept an arsenal inside: rifles, shotguns, handguns, all meticulously maintained, all loaded, all waiting silently for the confrontation he'd begun to anticipate with increasing dread. The news of Latimer's violent confrontation had spread quickly. Quiet whispers in the station hallways confirming what Klein had already feared. Elijah Cross was alive, methodical, and exacting justice on his own terms. Klein had fled shortly after, abandoning the pretense of normal life, retreating into defensive isolation as he prepared for war against a ghost he could neither avoid nor outsmart. Paranoia had long since settled into his bones, a companion as persistent and draining as fear itself, keeping him restless, vigilant, forever looking into shadows and listening for the slightest sound. But Elijah had always been patient, tactical, relentless, qualities that now served him perfectly. He had studied Klein's movements carefully, aware of the deputy's skill, aware he would offer the fiercest resistance of them all. Yet Elijah was equally certain this confrontation would end only one way. Days earlier, Elijah had quietly arrived at the perimeter of Klein's secluded property, unseen and undetected. He observed carefully, noting the layout, the routines, every nuance of Klein's defenses. Elijah moved silently under cover of darkness, avoiding sensors, disabling cameras one by one, cutting power to floodlights, leaving subtle but calculated vulnerabilities in Klein's carefully fortified defenses. He set traps of his own, simple, efficient snares and tripwires designed not to kill, but to incapacitate, to shift advantage permanently in Elijah's favor. Late in the evening, beneath a heavy sky obscured by thick clouds that turned the night nearly pitch black, Elijah made his careful advance toward the cabin. He moved with trained precision, weaving silently through the darkened woods, his breathing steady, every step deliberate. every sense acutely tuned to the slightest sound or movement around him. As he neared the cabin, the pale flicker of a lantern inside revealed Klein's silhouette, pacing restlessly across the wooden floor, weapon in hand, clearly agitated, prepared. Elijah slipped silently beneath one window, holding his breath, listening carefully for a break in Klein's relentless movement. A faint creak alerted him. Klein had stepped toward the front door, wary but determined, likely sensing instinctively that danger was near. Elijah pressed silently against the cabin wall, waiting patiently for the precise moment he'd prepared for. The cabin door swung open abruptly, its hinges creaking harshly as Klein stepped out onto the porch, shotgun raised, eyes darting across the shadowy terrain. Elijah remained utterly still, mere feet away, his heart slow, calm, methodical. Seconds stretched into silence, neither man moving, both listening intensely for the other's slightest breath. Suddenly, Elijah lunged upward from the shadows, seizing the shotgun barrel with blinding speed, wrenching it brutally from Klein's grasp before the deputy could fire. Klein reacted instantly, snarling fiercely, driving an elbow sharply into Elijah's jaw, knocking him back momentarily, blood filling Elijah's mouth from the unexpected strike. The fight exploded violently onto the porch, brutal and unrestrained. Klein tackled Elijah heavily against the cabin railing, wood cracking sharply beneath the impact, sending both men tumbling roughly onto the dirt below. They grappled furiously, fists landing viciously, elbows striking flesh and bone, neither giving ground. Elijah struck Klein repeatedly, methodically, targeting ribs, joints, anything vulnerable. Klein responded savagely, fists driving deep, desperately clawing for advantage. Klein, heavy and strong, managed to roll atop Elijah briefly, pinning him beneath massive weight. His fists rained down mercilessly, one landing brutally across Elijah's temple, sending bright spots of pain exploding behind Elijah's eyes. Elijah gritted his teeth through the blinding agony, fighting to regain position, driving a precise knee sharply into Klein's ribs, causing the deputy to grunt harshly. Breath knocked painfully from his lungs. They rolled apart briefly, each man rising swiftly to his feet, breathing heavily, blood streaming from cuts on both their faces, their eyes filled with deadly resolve. Klein spat blood into the dirt, glaring murderously at Elijah. Hatred mingled openly with fear. "You think killing me fixes anything, Cross?" Klein snarled, voice raw with rage and defiance. "Your mother isn't coming back no matter how many bodies you leave behind." Elijah's eyes narrowed dangerously, voice low, hard, edged with ice. "This isn't about bringing her back. It's about making sure you never bury the truth again." Klein lunged again suddenly, body crashing heavily against Elijah, sending them both violently through the cabin door, splintering wood and glass, scattering wildly around them. They crashed brutally onto the cabin floor, rolling furiously, struggling again for dominance, blows landing savagely, no mercy offered or expected. Inside the cabin, furniture shattered beneath their relentless violence, chairs splintering, a table collapsing beneath the weight of their desperate fight. Klein reached wildly for a nearby pistol, fingers closing desperately around the weapon. Elijah reacted instantly, driving his knee brutally into Klein's wrist, bones cracking audibly as the deputy screamed in pain, the gun sliding uselessly away across the floorboards. But Klein was far from finished, his eyes wild with fury, adrenaline masking any pain or fatigue. He swung violently at Elijah's head with his good hand, fingers curled like claws, seeking to gouge, to maim. Elijah blocked swiftly, countered with controlled precision, landing powerful blows to Klein's battered body, steadily wearing down the deputy's fierce resistance. Klein staggered backward, dazed and exhausted, barely able to raise his fists. Elijah advanced methodically, focused entirely on dismantling Klein's defenses. Every strike landed precisely, devastatingly effective, driving the deputy back step by brutal step until Klein collapsed, gasping raggedly, slumped against the cabin wall. Elijah loomed silently, breathing heavily but controlled, eyes locked coldly onto his defeated opponent. He stood over Klein, watching quietly as the deputy raised his head weakly, eyes blurred with blood and exhaustion. You have no idea." Klein gasped painfully, voice hoarse, filled suddenly with desperate truth. "You don't know what really happened. It wasn't just us. Wasn't just about race." Elijah hesitated, the first hint of uncertainty flickering in his expression. His voice was quiet, but hard as steel. "Then, tell me exactly what it was." Klein, broken and cornered, finally began to speak. Klein's breathing came in ragged gasps, harsh and desperate. Yet his eyes were still defiant, even as his battered body slumped heavily against the cabin wall. Elijah stood over him, chest rising and falling deeply, sweat mixing with blood that trickled from a deep cut above his brow. His own ribs ached sharply from the punishing blows Klein had delivered. The brutal encounter had exacted a toll on both men, leaving them raw, exhausted, and nearing collapse. But Elijah's gaze remained steady, cold, unwavering, focused entirely on the broken deputy at his feet. Klein spat blood onto the cabin floor, glaring upward through swollen eyes, his face contorted by a mixture of agony and hatred. Elijah moved closer again, grabbing him forcefully by the collar, lifting him partly upright, pressing his battered body roughly against the wall. "You have something to say?" Elijah asked sharply, his voice dangerously calm despite the fierce anger that burned quietly beneath it. "Speak clearly. Tell me why she had to die." Klein groaned in pain, but his mouth twisted into a grim, bloodied smile, revealing broken teeth. "You're chasing shadows, Cross," he rasped bitterly. "You think this was about one bad stop, one scared cop? It wasn't. It's bigger, so much bigger." Elijah tightened his grip, pressing harder, forcing another groan of pain from Klein. "Explain it, now." Klein's eyes flickered with hesitation, fear creeping slowly behind the bravado. He winced deeply, each breath causing visible agony. Finally, desperation pushed him toward reluctant truth. "It wasn't random. We were ordered to make it go away. Your mother wasn't killed because she was holding a camera. She was killed because someone powerful needed her out of the way. They knew exactly who she was. They knew you'd be there too." Elijah's grip loosened slightly in shock, though he quickly recovered his composure. "Who ordered it?" he demanded harshly. "Give me a name." Klein's jaw tightened stubbornly at first, but Elijah's fist suddenly drove deep into his stomach, doubling him over in agony, robbing him temporarily of breath. Klein slumped downward, choking for air, eyes wide with renewed fear. "It came from inside," he gasped painfully, "way above our pay grade. You think we chose to cover this up? You think we had that power?" "Names," Elijah repeated coldly, voice dangerously low, fists clenched tightly once more. "Now, Captain Hargrove," Klein finally hissed, blood dripping down his chin as he spoke the name. He was the one. He made sure no questions were asked, no evidence surfaced. He paid well for silence, money, favors, whatever it took. Elijah's eyes narrowed dangerously, his expression hardening even further. "Why would Hargrove target my mother?" Klein laughed harshly, bitterly, coughing painfully. "She found something she wasn't supposed to. She was never the target, initially. But she took pictures, evidence, something the captain needed buried. She was at the wrong place, wrong time. They knew who you were, Cross. They couldn't afford you digging around. Killing her guaranteed your silence. At least, that's what they believed." Elijah's pulse quickened, a fresh wave of pain, anger, and betrayal flooding through him, his fingers trembling slightly at the depth of what Klein had revealed. Miriam Cross hadn't been a victim of mistaken identity or random panic. She had stumbled unknowingly into something deeply corrupt, deliberately hidden. Her death had been a carefully calculated murder wrapped neatly inside a narrative of tragic accident and misunderstanding. Klein's mouth twisted painfully as he watched realization spread slowly across Elijah's face. "Now you see it," he muttered bitterly. "You're fighting ghosts. You'll never get close enough. They'll kill you long before you find the truth." Elijah shook his head slowly, anger turning icy, cold determination filling every corner of his heart. "I've faced worse." Klein smiled bitterly, bloody and broken. "You've faced nothing like this." Without warning, Klein lunged suddenly forward with surprising desperation, smashing his forehead directly into Elijah's nose, driving him backward sharply with explosive force. Elijah staggered heavily, vision blurring with searing pain, tasting blood filling his mouth as Klein scrambled desperately toward a fallen pistol across the floor. Elijah recovered instantly, lunging swiftly, brutally, crashing his body fully into Klein, knocking the gun away again. They grappled furiously once more, fists driving relentlessly into bruised flesh, bones cracking audibly beneath each savage blow. The room spun violently around them, furniture splintering again beneath the sheer force of their desperate struggle. Finally, Elijah landed a precise, brutal strike directly beneath Klein's chin, snapping the deputy's head back sharply, rendering him limp, unconscious, collapsing in a heap against the floorboards. Elijah stood over him once more, gasping painfully, his chest tight, blood streaming freely down his battered face. He knelt beside Klein's motionless form, swiftly checking the man's breathing. Alive, barely, but completely incapacitated. Elijah rose again, stepping quickly toward the hidden safe he'd noted earlier during their chaotic fight. Forcing the lock quickly, he retrieved the thick file within, eyes scanning rapidly over pages of documents, payments, photos, proof of corruption, bribery, betrayal, a conspiracy reaching far beyond the simple cruelty of those who had confronted Miriam at the canyon overlook. Elijah turned back toward Klein one final time, watching the unconscious deputy coldly, without satisfaction or remorse, only quiet resolution. Carefully, deliberately, Elijah tucked the damning file securely beneath his arm, knowing it represented far more than revenge. It was the leverage, the evidence, the key to dismantling a conspiracy that had robbed Miriam Cross of life and truth. With heavy, deliberate movements, Elijah left Klein broken, bound, and unconscious on the cabin floor, stepping silently out into the darkness once again, aware of the mission he had to complete, and knowing precisely how dangerous and deep it had become. As Elijah vanished quietly into the shadows beyond the isolated cabin, leaving behind the wreckage and silence of battle, he understood clearly that his fight had grown far larger than he'd imagined, and that justice was now more than vengeance. It was truth revealed, corruption exposed, a reckoning long overdue. Cody Moss had unraveled quickly in the weeks following Miriam Cross's death, unable to escape the relentless weight of guilt that settled upon his shoulders like a shadow he couldn't shake. Unlike his older, tougher colleagues, Cody lacked the hardness to bury the truth within himself. It gnawed constantly, stripping him of sleep, filling his nights with echoes of Miriam's calm voice, pleading for understanding moments before she fell. The memories were an unending torment, chasing him no matter where he went, haunting his every waking moment. He'd fled his apartment, avoiding contact with anyone he knew, and eventually found himself drifting from motel to motel, paying cash, speaking as little as possible, desperate to disappear. Each new place brought only temporary respite, the quiet hours filling quickly again with regret, fear, and paranoia. He knew Elijah Cross would come for him eventually. It was not a question of if, But when? Tonight found Cody hidden away at a cheap roadside motel just outside a dusty Arizona town. He paced restlessly in the tiny room, shadows from the neon vacancy sign flickering erratically across faded wallpaper. A laptop sat open on the small table. A dozen tabs displaying news stories about Brent Latimer's mysterious assault and Ray Klein's brutal injuries. Each headline tightened the knot in Cody's stomach, reminding him that his turn was coming. A gentle knock at the door startled Cody violently, his heart racing instantly, adrenaline surging through his veins. He hesitated, holding his breath, heart hammering loudly enough to drown out all other sounds. Another knock, quiet, steady, patient. "Housekeeping," a soft voice announced through the door, female and bored. Cody exhaled shakily, feeling suddenly ridiculous. He moved cautiously to the door and opened it a crack, mouth halfway through forming words of dismissal, when a powerful hand shoved the door inward, forcing him violently backward into the room. Before he could shout, Elijah Cross was already inside, shutting the door swiftly behind him and pressing Cody firmly but calmly against the wall with precise, military-trained movements. "Elijah, please, wait," Cody pleaded frantically, struggling weakly against Elijah's grip, eyes wide with panic and immediate surrender. Elijah's expression revealed neither rage nor hatred, only cool determination. "Stop resisting," he ordered quietly, voice firm, calm, deeply commanding. "Do exactly as I say and you won't be harmed." Cody stilled immediately, breath coming in short, panicked bursts. He nodded quickly, fear raw in his eyes. "Whatever you want, please. I never wanted what happened that day. I swear. Sit," Elijah instructed simply, guiding Cody toward the chair at the table with controlled strength. Cody complied instantly, shaking visibly as he dropped onto the seat, watching Elijah's every movement warily. Elijah stood directly across from him, eyes hard yet composed. "I know you've been carrying guilt," he began quietly. "I know it eats at you." Cody's voice trembled, eyes filling suddenly with tears. "You have no idea. It never stops. Every night, every moment I see her. I hear her voice. I know I should have stopped it, done something, but I was scared, weak. I'm so sorry." "Sorry isn't enough," Elijah replied coolly, though not unkindly. "I'm not here to hurt you. You're going to help me make this right." Cody swallowed hard, shaking uncontrollably. "I'll do anything. Just please, forgive me." Elijah's gaze softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "Forgiveness isn't mine to give, but justice is still possible. You're going to upload the original body cam footage, the truth, unedited, anonymously, where everyone can see." Cody hesitated, fear flashing across his face. "They'll know it's me. They'll kill me." "No one will know," Elijah assured him firmly, voice quiet but absolute. "You're going to follow my instructions precisely. Do exactly as I say, and you'll be safe." Cody nodded rapidly, wiping tears roughly from his eyes. "All right, show me how." Elijah moved swiftly, precisely, guiding Cody's trembling hands carefully through the process. The footage was soon ready on the laptop screen, raw and unfiltered, the clear, undeniable truth of Miriam Cross's final moments. Cody stared numbly at the frozen frame of Miriam standing calmly, moments before she fell, grief heavy on his features. "Send it," Elijah commanded softly, voice steady, calm. Cody exhaled shakily and obeyed, uploading the file anonymously, watching numbly as the progress bar filled slowly, inevitably. Once it completed, Elijah stepped back, satisfied. "It's done," Cody said, voice barely above a whisper, eyes downcast. "It's only the beginning," Elijah replied firmly, gathering the laptop quickly. He turned toward the door, pausing briefly before leaving. "Stay hidden, stay quiet, and remember, your silence almost buried the truth. Never let that happen again." But suddenly, from behind, Cody lunged instinctively, a final desperate act of fear, grabbing Elijah's shoulder with unexpected force. Elijah reacted instantly, his training sharp and precise, pivoting smoothly, grasping Cody's wrist firmly, and twisting it sharply behind his back, pressing him down onto the table face first, with controlled yet powerful pressure. "Please!" Cody gasped painfully, pinned effortlessly beneath Elijah's grip, wrist aching sharply. I panicked." "Stop," Elijah instructed coldly, voice deadly calm. "You're done fighting. You understand?" Cody nodded weakly, tears streaming down his cheeks. Elijah released him calmly, stepping back carefully. Cody sank shakily onto the chair again, visibly defeated, ashamed, unable to meet Elijah's eyes. Elijah stood quietly for a moment, breathing steadily, controlling the sharp pain in his side from the brief struggle. Ribs bruised again, but manageable. He looked down at Cody, saw clearly the man's genuine remorse, his absolute brokenness. "You're the only one who can live with what you did," Elijah finally said quietly, without anger or bitterness. "Use it. Remember it. Change from it." Without another word, Elijah stepped silently out into the night, leaving Cody trembling alone in the empty motel room. The footage was out now, visible to the entire world. Justice had taken another step forward, truth finally escaping into the open. Outside, Elijah vanished quickly into the shadows, feeling no triumph, only determination, as he moved steadily toward the conclusion of the fight he'd begun. He knew precisely where it led now. To Captain Hargrove, the man responsible for ordering the cover-up, the man who believed himself untouchable. Elijah Cross was ready, prepared and determined, aware of the truth he carried, and knowing clearly how far he still had left to go. Nightfall in Washington, D.C. brought darkness not just to the streets and alleys, but also into the distant hills, where power and secrets hid quietly behind gates and fences, disguised as luxury and privacy. Elijah Cross arrived silently, slipping into the city unnoticed, aware of exactly how to navigate a place accustomed to concealment and subterfuge. His arrival went unrecorded, his presence invisible. He was not here as himself. He was here as a shadow, moving quietly, methodically, toward a truth he knew lay buried behind walls and deception. Captain David Hargrove's private cabin sat hidden deep in the woods an hour outside the city, at the end of a narrow, tree-lined road marked with private property signs and guarded discreetly by security cameras and sensors. A secluded refuge, remote enough for the captain's private dealings and dark secrets to remain unseen. It was a place for quiet corruption to flourish unchecked, where secrets could be stored without scrutiny, evidence hidden safely away from prying eyes. Elijah approached carefully, silently, using darkness as cover, disabling the perimeter security with precise, practiced efficiency. Within minutes, he had breached the cabin's outer defenses, slipping quietly through a side window. His gloved hands moved smoothly, precisely, searching through desks, cabinets, drawers, quickly but meticulously. He knew exactly what he sought, guided by instinct sharpened through long years of training and patient, calculated vengeance. In a concealed cabinet behind the desk, Elijah discovered several encrypted flash drives, stacks of surveillance photos, documents marked confidential, and printed records of wire transfers. A quiet dread rose within him as he examined each item carefully. The photos and surveillance logs showed numerous prominent community figures. Activists, lawyers, teachers, many black, all vocal opponents of privatized policing initiatives expanding rapidly across vulnerable neighborhoods. Elijah's pulse quickened as he recognized Miriam's face clearly among them, her image circled, annotated carefully, dates and times meticulously documented. Heart pounding now, Elijah rapidly decoded the flash drives, revealing a comprehensive surveillance database containing detailed profiles, movements, and personal information of dozens of targeted individuals. Miriam Cross's file was extensive, captured images of her attending community meetings, screenshots of her social media posts criticizing increased police presence, records of conversations she'd had with local leaders opposed to the privatized policing contracts the city had quietly awarded. Miriam, a retired educator respected deeply in her community, had unknowingly become a crucial threat simply because she'd documented something far more sinister than mere corruption: systematic, intentional targeting of communities of color by private policing companies funded by lucrative government contracts. Elijah's fingers tightened involuntarily around the printed documents, fury quietly building within him as he saw the extent of what Miriam had uncovered. Her camera, the very item that had ended her life, had captured photographic evidence of a private police unit's violent and illegal actions sanctioned and concealed by Captain Hargrove himself. Miriam had unintentionally documented a brutal beating and illegal detention, an incident authorities claimed never occurred. When Hargrove discovered she had photographic evidence, he had ordered his men to recover it at any cost. Miriam's death was no accident, no misunderstanding. She was deliberately silenced, the truth she carried extinguished without hesitation. As Elijah quickly copied every piece of evidence, carefully preserving the files and images, his fury remained quiet, controlled, tempered by clarity of purpose. His mother had died not merely from a frightened deputy's reaction, but from a direct order intended to bury evidence of deep corruption extending to the highest levels of law enforcement. The scale was staggering. Hargrove was merely one player among many, but his signature appeared repeatedly on payments, directives, and official documents designed to shield private policing contractors from oversight and accountability. His task nearly completed, Elijah suddenly heard the distant crunch of tires on gravel. The captain had arrived unexpectedly early. Without panic or hesitation, Elijah concealed himself silently within a shadowed corner of the cabin, calmly awaiting Hargrove's entry. Hargrove stepped through the cabin door moments later, pausing briefly as though sensing something out of place. Before he could react, Elijah swiftly emerged from his concealment, moving with calculated precision, smoothly disarming Hargrove of the firearm concealed beneath his jacket. The captain stumbled backward, startled, eyes wide with immediate fear and recognition. "Cross," Hargrove stammered, raising his hands slowly, voice tense yet attempting authority. "You don't know what you're doing. You don't know the scale of—" "Quiet," Elijah interrupted softly, calmly. His voice carried no rage, only cold resolve. "I know everything. Miriam Cross died because she was a threat to your plans. Because she took pictures you couldn't afford to have public, you ordered her death." Hargrove's jaw tightened stubbornly, defiance flickering briefly before collapsing beneath fear. "It wasn't personal, Cross. It was business. Bigger than you or me. Private policing keeps things profitable, efficient. If her evidence got out, everything would have collapsed." "My mother was killed to protect your profits," Elijah replied icily, voice dangerously quiet. "You sold communities to the highest bidder. You made peace a commodity and justice irrelevant." Hargrove stepped back slowly, panic rising visibly. "You can't stop it," he muttered shakily. "You won't survive if you expose it." "Neither will you," Elijah said simply, without anger, without hesitation. "You destroyed lives for money, but now the truth is out." Before Hargrove could speak again, Elijah moved swiftly, delivering a single decisive strike, leaving the captain unconscious on the cabin floor, breathing but incapable of pursuit. Elijah left quickly, carrying the copied evidence carefully, knowing clearly what must come next. Emerging into the night, Elijah vanished quickly again into the darkness, moving quietly toward the city, the truth finally secured, ready to be delivered where it could no longer be ignored. He carried proof now, not merely of Miriam's innocence, but of a far-reaching conspiracy of greed, violence, and corruption that had systematically targeted and silenced vulnerable communities protected and funded by men like Hargrove. Justice would no longer be quiet, Elijah knew, as he moved steadily onward, determined to make sure the truth Miriam had died protecting would finally see the light. He had uncovered everything he needed. Now the entire corrupt network would answer for their actions. Elijah Cross was no longer fighting for personal vengeance alone. He carried with him a truth far greater, one powerful enough to dismantle a system built upon cruelty, corruption, and exploitation. And now, at last, justice had begun its final, undeniable march toward daylight. Morning broke over the nation's capital with deceptive calm, the soft hues of dawn masking the storm about to engulf the entire country. Elijah Cross had returned quietly, anonymous and unseen, but his presence was felt immediately. Within hours of his silent exit from Captain Hargrove's cabin, the world awoke to a storm it could no longer ignore. Anonymous uploads began appearing across news channels, social media, and investigative forums, raw and unedited footage directly revealing the truth that had been so carefully hidden. The body cam footage of Miriam Cross's shooting surged rapidly across screens everywhere, horrifying millions who watched a peaceful woman pleading calmly for reason. Her life violently ended in a blur of gunfire born from panic and prejudice. But it wasn't only Miriam's death that shocked and enraged the public. Soon afterward, another anonymous upload followed. This time, the desperate, trembling confessions of Trooper Brent Latimer and Deputy Ray Klein appeared, captured clearly in Elijah's quiet, precise recordings. Voices trembled, heavy with fear and regret, admitting to pressure from above, deliberate orders to cover up evidence, and coldly calculated attempts to silence any questions surrounding Miriam's tragic killing. News outlets seized the revelations, the footage dominating headlines, sparking nationwide outrage. Communities mobilized, protests erupting spontaneously in cities and towns across the country, demanding accountability and immediate investigations. Journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens demanded answers, calling openly for justice, not just for Miriam Cross, but for the countless others victimized by a corrupted system allowed to operate unchecked. Among those watching was Cody Moss, alone and terrified, but now driven by a new determination he had never before known. The guilt he carried had transformed slowly into a resolve to do what he'd lacked the courage for before. He watched the videos spread, watched the public react, and knew instinctively his silence had become intolerable, his complicity unforgivable. Elijah Cross had spared him, had given him a chance at redemption, and Cody knew it was finally time to repay that act, not with fear or cowardice, but with truth. Late that night, Cody, still trembling but resolute, carefully uploaded the files Elijah had quietly entrusted him with. The files containing explicit evidence exposing Captain David Hargrove's personal involvement in the private policing initiative, the direct orders he'd given to target Miriam, and the money trails connecting him to lucrative contracts aimed at policing predominantly black communities. Cody made certain everything was carefully anonymized, meticulously detailed, ensuring absolute clarity. Once finished, he stepped away from the computer, breathing heavily, realizing he had just ignited a fire that could not be extinguished. Within hours, the documents had spread nationwide, splashed across every screen. Hargrove's hidden corruption, his explicit involvement in targeting and silencing community activists, became impossible to deny. The public outcry became a roar, demanding immediate action against the officers and politicians involved in a systematic and horrific betrayal of the public trust. Captain Hargrove was immediately suspended, then placed under arrest, his confident facade finally crumbling under the overwhelming weight of undeniable evidence. For the first time in weeks, Cody Moss allowed himself to weep openly, not from fear, but from relief and a sense of justice finally moving forward. He knew clearly the danger he faced, but at last his conscience was clear. Meanwhile, Elijah Cross watched quietly from the shadows, monitoring the rapid unraveling of the conspiracy he had carefully exposed. He had not come this far for vengeance alone. Now it was something far larger. Truth itself, finally released into daylight, demanding to be heard and answered for. Elijah's role had always been silent, methodical, relentless, but now it was others who would carry the torch openly. Journalists, activists, whistleblowers, and ordinary people finally empowered by the truth. National news coverage intensified dramatically, detailing how the privatized policing initiative had systematically exploited vulnerable neighborhoods, disproportionately targeting communities of color under Hargrove's corrupt leadership. The revelations sparked official inquiries, federal investigations, and immediate calls for systemic reform. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves, corporate executives faced criminal charges, and long-suppressed stories finally emerged openly into public discourse. Elijah knew this was exactly what Miriam had risked everything to uncover. He felt a deep pride mingled with grief, knowing she had given her life unknowingly for justice, not only for herself, but for thousands who had suffered quietly beneath a system built on cruelty, greed, and exploitation. The truth Miriam had carried, the truth that had cost her life, had finally blossomed fully into national recognition, forcing accountability from those who had hidden behind power for far too long. Still anonymous, Elijah moved silently through crowded streets where citizens marched with banners and signs demanding justice, dignity, and accountability. He felt an unfamiliar warmth seeing her name repeated openly, respectfully, passionately, the crowd recognizing the quiet heroism of a woman whose courage had outlived her. The scale of what had been revealed was unprecedented, undeniable, impossible to silence or dismiss. Within days, Captain Hargrove and his network of corruption faced ruin. Charges filed, hearings scheduled, careers ended, and reputations destroyed. Yet Elijah knew it was only the beginning. Dismantling a system so deeply entrenched required sustained vigilance, continued pressure, relentless truth. He watched from a quiet distance, knowing the mission was no longer his alone. It now belonged to everyone. He had done exactly what he'd set out to achieve, delivering justice Miriam deserved, revealing the truth, exposing corruption so deeply hidden it had nearly gone unnoticed forever. As the sun set again over the nation's capital, Elijah Cross stepped back from the edge of chaos he'd quietly created, knowing clearly his fight had reached its climax. It was no longer his alone. The battle belonged now to the entire nation. Empowered by truth, anger, grief, and hope, he had set justice into motion, irreversible and unstoppable. He no longer needed violence or vengeance. The nation's voice was louder, clearer, more powerful than any single man's actions. And now, Elijah, finally, silently, withdrew again, vanishing seamlessly into the anonymity from which he had emerged. His work was finished, but the story, the fight for truth and justice, was only beginning. The world had finally seen clearly, awakened by Miriam Cross's courage, by Cody Moss's redemption, and by Elijah Cross's relentless, unyielding pursuit of truth. Morning light crept slowly across the quiet Arizona hills, touching the edges of a country still in the grip of change. The footage of Miriam Cross's death, the officer confessions, and the documents Cody Moss had leaked were everywhere now. On every screen, in every paper, on the lips of every person demanding accountability. The truth had broken through. Captain David Hargrove had been arrested. His name was stripped from the department's honors, his legacy erased by the mountain of evidence uncovered in his cabin. The privatized policing contracts he'd helped build were frozen, their executives subpoenaed. Federal investigations swept across the departments involved, targeting every official who had looked the other way. Miriam's name rang out in protests across the country, not as a victim, but as a symbol. Her quiet grace, her dignity, her willingness to speak when others stayed silent, had become a rallying cry. Cody Moss stood before a Senate hearing just days later, his voice steady as he read from a brief statement. He admitted everything. The cover-up, the pressure, his failure to stop what he knew was wrong. He named Hargrove. He confirmed the orders to bury what happened. And then he stepped aside, allowing the system he once served to face itself. Brent Latimer and Ray Klein faced trial. Neither denied the footage. Neither could. The courts moved swiftly. And, for once, so did the verdict. Guilty. Both. Justice had finally spoken. And through it all, Elijah Cross said nothing. He didn't appear at the protests. He didn't give interviews. He didn't stand in the courtroom or sit in the back row of any hearing. He wasn't in the footage. His name was never mentioned by the men who had once feared him most. But, behind it all, they knew. Some said he was spotted one last time at Miriam's grave, kneeling quietly in the early morning before sunrise. No words, no ceremony, just a man, still and silent, hands in his pockets, wind moving softly through the trees. And then he was gone. No trail, no voice, no goodbye. Elijah Cross disappeared, without noise, without credit, without want of recognition. He had done what he came to do. Justice had been served. He left quietly, like a shadow returning to the earth. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.